Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining me to hear this presentation. I'm going to be talking about the Dark Goddess, my PhD research on her, and my experiences of doing that research as a pagan. So my name is Áine and I've been a practicing pagan for more than half my life at this point. I'm a naturalistic pantheist, so even though I do work with various deities to some extent, mostly the Morrigan and a handful of others, I mostly see the gods as archetypes. I've been blogging and making YouTube videos about my spiritual practice for about 7 years at this point. And back in 2015, I decided that I wanted to make a change in my career and get a chance to study spirituality at an academic level. So I moved here to Edinburgh from Ireland to do a master's degree in religious studies and subsequently a PhD. I'm in the very final stages of finishing that PhD now. So, the Dark Goddess. Many of you will have your own understanding of who she is and what that title means. Some of you may have devotional practices for her or for goddesses whom you or others might consider dark goddesses. My interest in the concept of the Dark Goddess came about through my connection to the Morrigan, which goes back to my very early days as a teenage pagan in the mid-2000s. And I've had an on and off devotional relationship to her ever since. Today I want to give you an overview of what my research on the Dark Goddess has looked like and the kinds of theoretical conclusions I've reached through that research, and I'll also talk about what doing a PhD on this topic has been like as a pagan, as an insider in this community. So first of all, my definition of the Dark Goddess was based around the non-fiction books I was able to find that were about the Dark Goddess and had that term in their title. I'd come across the term, I think, through YouTube, and I'd heard pagans mention both a book by Jane Meredith called Journey to the Dark Goddess, How to Return to Your Soul, and I'd also come across Stephanie Woodfield's book on the Morrigan that was titled Celtic Lore and Spellcraft of the Dark Goddess. I was interested to see what the consensus was on this title. I found that there were only 13 published non-fiction books with Dark Goddess in their title published before 2019. There have been a few published since, but those haven't made it into my research. So the first phase of my research was doing a close reading of all of them. And then I also did a hunt for all of the YouTube videos I could find with Dark Goddess in their title too, to give me a broader and maybe more up-to-date idea of how the community was using this term. The first seemingly simple question I needed to ask myself for this research was, who is the Dark Goddess? And through analysing these books and videos, I realised that the answer to this was really bound up in her ontological relationship to the self. In other words, to what extent the Dark Goddess is a part of the self, to what extent she's understood to be something beyond or outside the self, and the ways that these aspects of her interact. Of course, dark components of the goddess have been present in her image throughout the development of contemporary paganism. The goddess has always been connected to both life and death, and the importance of acknowledging death and darkness in the creative cosmic cycle. But the concept of the Dark Goddess as a discrete archetype or entity first appears in publication in the early 1990s. And there's a strong therapeutic theme across these books and the later videos. They kind of started from about 2011. There might have been some videos before that date, and maybe they've been deleted, but that was what was available to me during the time of my research. And most people who talk about the Dark Goddess emphasize her role in transforming yourself. And that's true for the books and for the YouTube videos as a whole. Especially in the books published in the 90s. The Dark Goddess is portrayed really in psychological terms as a metaphor for repressed, subjugated and misunderstood aspects of womanhood. Several of those in the early cluster of Dark Goddess texts were written by Jungian analysts, and they weave together various goddess mythologies with some of Jung's ideas of the Dark Mother archetype and the shadow or repressed nature of the self. So these texts urge the reader to embrace the difficult and unappealing sides of both the self and of life, and they posit that embracing this is necessary for personal transformation and growth. So on the one hand, this is tied up in an understanding of the Dark Goddess as something internal, as a part of the inner self which needs to be accessed. and which ultimately brings about positive change. On the other hand, this therapeutic element is often portrayed as something that is impressed or even inflicted from without, and so the dark goddess is also portrayed as an external agent. And both of these understandings are usually seen side by side in the texts. This ambiguous understanding of the dark goddess really ties in very well with my own ambiguous beliefs about divinity, and this might be one of the reasons I was drawn to do this research in the first place. But one thing I struggled with a lot while doing this research was with finding a balance between maintaining objectivity and approaching the material with the regard of someone who is emotionally invested in its content. Early on in my research, I found I was straying too much into dissecting the social components of movements like the dark goddess material, and I was really losing sight of the value that I found in these kinds of ideas. I realised that if I was going to produce a piece of work that I was proud of and that I thought could make some kind of contribution to both the academic community and the pagan community, I would really have to delve into the theological content of the dark goddess material. In the field of religious studies, it's generally frowned upon to take any kind of theological stance. So in other words, to make any sort of spiritual claims or assumptions about the true nature of divinity or of the experiences that religious people or spiritual people have. There's a lot of talk about methodological agnosticism, and I thought this would be no problem for me considering I am fairly agnostic myself when it comes to questions about the nature of divinity. But I actually found that it was very easy to slip into a sort of methodological atheism if I was trying too much to suppress my personal investment in the topic. Because of the big focus on the self in the dark goddess material, it would have been easy to focus on that therapeutic aspect and basically to insinuate through omission that there was nothing more to the whole thing than a social movement aiming to psychologically heal the self. So the dark goddess is associated with the self in two primary ways from what I've seen in my research. She's seen, as I've said, as part of the self or arising from the self, and she's also associated more generally with the exploration of the self. When the dark goddess is associated with the inner realm, she's often equated with the shadow, as I've mentioned. The shadow is a concept born from Jungian mythology, as I also mentioned, and this shadow encompasses a lot and performs quite a lot of functions, but primarily it's a repressed part of the self, so it's part of the personality that are deemed unacceptable by society or by the individual, and so the individual denies these parts of themselves and relegates them to the unconscious. The unconscious is generally seen, again with quite a Jungian influence, as almost a physical space. And similarly, the inner self is a destination, a place that the conscious self can visit. The dark goddess is often cast as being that very inwardness. For some of the authors and YouTubers, she is that inner place. She is an embodiment or a personification of the unconscious. Jane Meredith describes the dark goddess in her book as speaking in an inner voice. Hers is the voice of our own soul, which speaks as tiny internal promptings. The shadow is part of that inner realm, and the dark goddess material generally advocates the exploration and acceptance of that shadow self. The dark goddess as the shadow can also be seen as a distortion of the true feminine nature or the true dark goddess. And so her undesirability and her association with repression can be seen as a negative patriarchal interpretation of true feminine authenticity rather than reflecting the true face of the divine feminine. But either way, the dark goddess as the shadow is a deeply buried and repressed part of the female that needs to be accessed and expressed. So then the dark goddess is approached as part of an effort to reconcile the different parts of the self. And meeting the dark goddess is a meeting with a hidden but vital part of that self. The dark goddess isn't just seen as something that one encounters in the inner realm. She's also linked in various ways to the process of that inward journey. She is described by one author as a guardian figure of the mysterious depths of our unconscious. And across the materials, she's not only a guardian, but a driving force or catalyst, pushing the individual to explore and engage with the inner self. The idea of the journey into the self and to the dark goddess is seen across all the material, and particularly in Jane Meredith's book, which is titled Journey to the Dark Goddess. The dark goddess is the destination in this journey when she's understood as the unconscious or the shadow, but she also facilitates it. One author describes the dark goddess as being present in the forces of our personality that guide us into the darkness. In the dark goddess material, divinity is therefore found within the self. The ultimate goal of the journey into the inner realm seems to be a true or authentic self, whether or not this true self is associated with the shadow or with a darker, repressed, or less acceptable part of the self. The dark goddess is essentially associated with the accessing of this self and with this authenticity. The true self and the dark goddess are often described as one and the same, and at the same time, the finding of the self is equated to the finding of the dark goddess. One way to read this is to understand the dark goddess as a metaphor for this true self and for the dark and difficult journey to unearth it. But we can also understand this as a deification of part of the self. This dark goddess at the heart of the individual is simultaneously something that transcends the self, or an echo in the self of a greater divinity. So of course, even for those of us who have an archetypal understanding of deities, the idea of finding the goddess within, or seeing the journey to the goddess as an inward journey, is not as simple as reducing divinity to a metaphor for the self. And this is reflected in how the dark goddess is simultaneously portrayed as beyond the self, transcendent of the self, or other to the self in many ways. She might be primarily associated with ebbs and flows of your personal inner life and with the cycles of the female body, but she's also consistently associated with the cycles of the earth and of the universe. The texts describe her as a personification of the moon's lunar energies, which is an embodiment of the continually self-renewing energy of nature. The texts often draw a connection between the individual body and the earth, which is often described as the body of the goddess, and they describe the human body as part of our connection to the natural world and to the goddess. So the dark goddess's presence in the material is not limited to the body of the individual or to single entities such as the moon. The force of the dark goddess is described as being immanent and everywhere in nature. So these texts and videos describe the dark goddess as part of nature, manifest in the cycles of the earth and of human life. But they also describe her in more transcendent terms, as something magical, spiritual, mystical, or simply divine. She's a creative, all-encompassing primordial force that pervades or underlies the fabric of cosmos. This primordial essence is connected to her darkness and to her mysterious, occluded nature. Several authors describe the dark goddess as, by definition or in essence, a mystery, and they connect this mystery of the dark goddess to her darkness, a darkness which one YouTube video creator describes as both the literal dark, the nighttime, as well as the metaphysical dark, the unknown, the underworld. To enter into the realm of the dark goddess therefore requires an alternative perspective. It requires a kind of altered state of consciousness and an understanding that transcends the rational mind. And this is reflected in the trance-like meditative state involved in all the practices these texts describe to approach the dark goddess. Once the experience of the dark goddess has taken hold, the new perception of the practitioner becomes undeniable, and the journey to the underworld seems like a sort of initiation ritual. One YouTuber describes her change in perception as a point of no return. She can't unsee what she's seen or go back to who she was before this dark goddess encounter. And while the mystery of the dark goddess is sometimes expressed in positive terms of union or of wonder, fear of the destructive power of the dark goddess is actually quite common. Authors refer to the terrifying image that the dark goddess presents, and although her destructive power is related to healing qualities that bring renewal, she is also a figure who brings havoc into people's lives and forces them to confront their fears. This fear that is so strongly associated with the dark goddess is often expressed as a simple primal fear of the unknown, of the strange or the uncanny. And so this sensation of strangeness is posited as a signpost towards the dark goddess. The fear evoked by the dark goddess therefore arises from the sense that she is not a part of the self. She is often close to the self, perhaps too close for comfort, but ultimately something transcendent of the self, something unfathomable, powerful, and potentially dangerous in her otherness. As one YouTuber notes, she forces the individual to confront these fears and thus takes you out of your comfort zone. This YouTuber goes so far to suggest that if you're doing a dark goddess ritual and you feel at ease and totally comfortable, it's perhaps not really going there, not really looking her in the eye. Whether or not this fearful dark goddess is located within the psyche rather than an external entity, and the experience of her is of true otherness, a level of discomfort, fear, and vulnerability that can really only arise if the dark goddess is truly understood to be outside the power and control of the individual. For me, one of the most interesting things about the dark goddess is this ambiguity across her literature on her ontological nature. She's sometimes very much of the self and sometimes very much other to the self. But most often, she's actually simultaneously both. She's something within the self that is other to normal consciousness and to mundane life. And she is something outside the self, an integral, primordial part of nature, and a kernel or spark of this primordial essence can be found within the deep, authentic self. It's in the boundary between these two understandings that the dark goddess lies. So in the search for the authentic self lies a search for an ultimate truth. Even in her guise as the shadow, the dark goddess is not only individual, she's also described as a societal shadow and as the repressed or unacceptable parts of womanhood generally. And the embracing of these repressed parts is not only done in a spirit of personal empowerment or of a rejection of a patriarchal perception of what is and is not acceptable. The implication is that there is a divine entity of some kind whose essence has been singularly targeted and driven out of society. So by recognizing the presence of that essence within the self, dark goddess devotees express a worldview in which the boundary between the self and divinity is mutable. The ultimate primordial creative divinity of the dark goddess has been rejected and obfuscated in the individual and in society. And in seeking to reawaken this archetype, the dark goddess devotee is pursuing contact with an all-encompassing divinity that connects the individual to the universal. The fluid boundary between the divine self and divine other creates an interplay between this subjective interior and objective reality. And this fluid border of the self is expressed not only in the meeting of the dark goddess in the mind, but also in her physical expression and embodiment in the practices that are described by these authors and video creators. For most of the authors, the dark goddess is primarily located in the psyche, and it's through exploring and understanding that psyche that she can be found or experienced. The rituals and processes that these authors describe in order to consciously or deliberately take the journey to the underworld mostly consist of lying in a darkened room and doing a sort of self-guided meditation where the practitioner imagines themselves into the story of Inanna's descent to the underworld or another similar myth. In this process, the practitioner is seeking out the dark goddess within. But as I've described, the essence or force they are seeking is not always understood to be contained solely within. And so the dark goddess is also manifested in the body, and she can therefore be understood to be fully embodied, and this very embodiment is understood to facilitate the release of her repression. The connection of a woman to her body, to her reproductive and sexual cycles, is deemed crucial to her healing and regeneration as an individual. The repression of certain aspects of femininity related in these texts to the concept of the shadow is understood to be located in and thus healed through greater connection to the body. Embodied expressions of the dark goddess are therefore central to the journey to her, or experience of her. The dark goddess becomes not only something experienced in the body and its cycles, but something that is actually created and experienced through bodily creative action. Authors describe taking on the energy of the dark goddess and thus becoming her through ritual action. Some recommend various bodily practices or means by which to access the dark goddess through embodied expression, such as going out into the wilderness and making animal cries and screams, or making wild sounds of breathing and growling. While one YouTuber laughs at these uncomfortable and weird sounds, she notes that this practice took her and her coven mates to a genuine place. And so the exploration of the boundary between the interior psychologized self and the physical embodied self is just as crucial to the authentic experience of the divine. The main conclusions that I'm drawing in my PhD have turned out to be mostly around the power inherent in framing one's life through certain kinds of stories, and ultimately about the therapeutic and transformative potential of the Dark Goddess discourse. So I was interested to discuss the ways in which the self is portrayed as a creative construct, something that is changed and even brought into being through the Dark Goddess experience. This construction of the self is reflected as well in the embodied practices that I've described, in the way in which the dancing and growling and screaming is portrayed as a way to produce a new self, one which is closer to the authenticity of the Dark Goddess. But I wanted to make sure that I wasn't reducing these narratives to a therapeutic practice. By including analysis of the Dark Goddess as other to the self, as well as being part of the self, I was able to avoid simplifying this concept of divinity and reflect the mystical aspects of the Dark Goddess experience. From my experience of writing and of making videos about my spiritual practice and beliefs, I was used to making statements about my own beliefs and experiences, and stepping away from doing that was initially quite confusing for me. But I found that through giving a rounded description of how the Dark Goddess is described and spoken about, even while maintaining objectivity, I was able to avoid slipping into methodological atheism, where my writing may sound as though I was assuming that the Dark Goddess is nothing more than a projection of the self. From a social scientific perspective, I decided that the best thing for me to theorize on was the stories that the authors and video creators have chosen to share. I decided to explore how the creation of narratives can construct one's identity and even become a form of social resistance. In looking to the Dark Goddess, her devotees seek inspiration, strength, and wisdom from an outer source, a source that can provide resources far beyond that available to the individual within themselves. But by understanding the Dark Goddess as also residing within, something to be reached within the self, and storied through autobiographical narratives, she has a hugely empowering potential. Her nature suggests that there is no hard boundary between the individual and the divine patterns and nature of the universe. And this is emphasized through connecting her and her stories to people's autobiographical narratives. By taking the narratives of the books and videos and addressing them in their own right, rather than trying to go down a level further and actually analyze the experiences themselves, I was able to avoid having to make any ontological statements about the nature of the Dark Goddess or the self, and instead talk about the process of sharing and storying those experiences. Of course, I also faced a strange situation of trying to objectively study a community of which I was actually a part, an insider attempting to don the hat of an outsider. The insider-outsider conundrum has been much discussed in the field of anthropology, with some insisting that if the anthropologist holds the same beliefs as the natives, they may be surrendering anthropological authority. On the other hand, true understanding of the beliefs and practices of a community may not be possible from a thoroughly outside perspective. An ethnographer experiences the paradox of being both participant and observer, and this may be even more complicated for someone who was, like me, already a participant of the community before turning observer. I found that this problem was also somewhat resolved by the approach I took of analysing public narratives rather than attempting participant observation. So first of all, I didn't have to worry about ethical conundrums I might have faced if I were to base my research on any private interactions, as it may be hard to differentiate between interactions made in confidence to me in my role as a fellow YouTuber versus interactions made on the record, so to speak. Using videos and published texts in the public domain made this differentiation clearer. And taking that step back from the experiences of the Dark Goddess in the moment of ritual or communion with her to the narratives and ideas that are shared about her meant that I wasn't inserting my own voice into the material I was reading, though of course my own perspective is unavoidable in the process of analysis. In the end, I think my research process ended up looking a lot like my own personal approach to paganism. I'm the kind of person who is skeptical by nature, and I can struggle to really step into the experience of ritual or of devotion if I get too bogged down in my literal understanding of what deities are. I definitely find some value in theological rumination, but I find the most value in exploring and embodying different stories as a way to creatively express my subjective experience of the world and of divinity. For me, that is the way in which the divinity in me touches the divinity beyond me, by stepping out of my mundane perspective on the world and into a story like that of the Dark Goddess. Thanks for listening.